Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this next segment in our intro to Virtual DOM and the VComponent API. In this segment, we're going to talk about what the Virtual DOM architecture is, what the VComponent API is, how you can get started using it, and when you should actually use it. There may be times when it's not really something you want. So let's start with what it is. So the new virtual DOM architecture that Jet is producing and allowing you to develop new applications using is entirely based on TypeScript. So that's the first thing you're going to need to learn, is to use TypeScript in order to work in this new architecture. It's based on an open source library called Preact. Preact is pretty much a smaller version of React. And in learning Preact, you will spend most of your time in the React documentation, learning about properties or props and states and things of that nature. You're going to use JSX, or in our case, TSX for TypeScript, and it's all contained in one file, at least for the component that you're building, a TSX file. Now we'll get into the details of how you can set it up, how the CLI will work and things like that in the how it all works section. But this architecture, it's important to understand that this is a new architecture. It is not backward compatible with the existing MVVM architecture. When you write a new application using the VDOM architecture, it is a new application. There isn't a migration from MVVM over to Virtual DOM. This is where the VComponent API comes in, though. This VComponent API is a new way of building web components, W3C compliant standard web components. You're going to use that virtual DOM architecture inside of the VComponent API. But the VComponent API, along with the Jet tooling, will produce a standards-based web component, a custom element, just as you've seen in using the composite component architecture, or CCA, in the existing MVVM architecture. These components are fully interoperable between the different architectures. So this is kind of the interoperability layer between what you've got going on in Knockout and this new VDOM architecture using Preact. So we're going to allow you to take your existing application based on Knockout, based on MVVM, and extend pieces of it or modify pieces of it over time by encapsulating some of those parts into this new VDOM architecture, into new VComponent API-based web components and custom elements. Now, I mentioned Preact as the open source library that we're basing the virtual DOM architecture on. And for those that aren't familiar with Preact or React, Preact is a thinner version or a more lightweight version of React, and it actually works a little bit closer to the real document object model. Most classic example of that is React uses synthetic events in order to do eventing, whereas Preact actually uses live DOM JavaScript events. So that makes it a little bit easier for us in the Jet team to interact with Preact when we're trying to build web components and work with this web component standard. And that's one of the main reasons that we chose it. Now, for you to learn what's going on and how to use the virtual DOM architecture, you're going to spend a lot of time in the React documentation. And then you can look at the Preact website to see the slight differences that are in the differences between the two libraries themselves. It's not that much to learn as far as the differences. There's plenty to learn within React itself and understanding how to build those architectures. There is, however, a new developer's guide specifically for developing virtual DOM applications. So we're trying to get you a good jump start on how to understand what's going on in virtual DOM, as well as how to get started and what it can provide for you in the new tooling and so forth. So this is a great new documentation set, and it will get you started in a good direction and a good understanding of what's going on with VDOM itself. For learning to work with the VComponent API, we've provided an entire tutorial, an actual application that you can work your way through from the start all the way into getting into quite a bit more advanced topics. All of these different things, from working with metadata and nesting components and slots, actions, states, things of this nature, all within one application called a VComponent tutorial. Now, this application will also give you a lot of information about prerequisites of what information you need to use or understand before you can work with the VComponent API, and by nature also the VDOM architecture. And it will give you some links of some different resources to go off and read about and understand. Okay, so at this point, you may say, okay, I understand the basics of virtual DOM architecture. I understand the VComponent API somewhat. How do I get started? Where do I go to? How do I get things going? Well, it starts at the CLI. You can start at the VComponent tutorial that we just talked about, and clicking on getting started will actually take you into a step where you're going to install the CLI and get going using that. Or you can just use the CLI directly, as if you've done it before, you've installed the CLI, and it's pretty much npm-g I for install at Oracle ojet-CLI. That will install the most recent production release of Jet. And while you're watching this video, it probably is Jet version 11. Now, once you have that installed, you can verify that by just running ojet-version, and this will tell you the version of the CLI that you have installed. It's not the version of your app, but it's the version of the command line interface. Once you have that installed, running ojet create VDOM test, make that VDOM, not CDOM. VDOM test, use -- template equals basic. We only have the one template for virtual DOM. There's only one template that's needed, and we'll discuss that in a minute. So you're not going to be able to do app drawer or app tab or something of that nature. Or nav drawer, nav tab. It's just going to be basic. Finally, finish that command with a -- VDOM and run it, and it will scaffold up an application for you. I've already scaffolded this exact application, so it takes 2 or 3 minutes to do it, depending on the operating system you have and the internet connection that you have for pulling down all of the different NPM modules and so forth. Once it's done, you're just going to change directory into there. I'm going to launch my Visual Studio Code at this point, which I have this project opened up in. You'll see the directory structure in here is quite a bit slimmer than the old projects that we used to have. It still has the source directory as the main section that you would use in source control and things of that nature. Under here, you're not going to see TS or JS for TypeScript and JavaScript or so forth. Everything is in TypeScript in this world, and it's all pretty succinct. The index.html, of course, is our starting point, but you don't see a ton in here. You've got the head, which is loading in just your CSS, some of your base CSS, some of the fonts and things of that nature. And then really, there's one custom element called app-root. That's the basis of your virtual DOM application. Everything is going to come out of this one component, or this one VComponent. If we look at app.tsx under components, app.tsx is the actual component and the definition. And you'll see here this decorator of custom element is registering a custom element called app-root. This is part of the VComponent API. You can go into the details of this by going through the tutorial. I just want to run through the structure with you real quick to show you what it looks like and where you can find things. Now you'll notice that I've actually started looking at my components under this components directory. If you look now in the Oracle Jet config.json file, you'll notice that in here we have a components option now, and you can define that and call it anything you want or name it anything you want. The tooling, when you do a build, will turn around and grab whatever this is and then build the components that are inside of that directory. So you can rename quite a few different things in here as you go through. The app, again, is the root. It's going to import a footer component, a header component, and a content component. These are different types of Preact components. We've kind of mixed them up so that you can see really quickly some of the different examples of how things will work. If I open up my footer and my header, content is actually under a directory called content. So we don't care how you lay things out. You're going to simply do an import, which is going to tell us where the file is for whatever this component is that you're going to use. You'll notice in the actual app component, my return or my render method is just returning this small piece of DOM, and it's loading in these other components that are defined in other files. If I look at the footer, we're going to see that this is just a Preact library that's getting loaded in, and this is a Preact functional component. So that's just an example of how you might work with a functional component. The header is an example of a class-based Preact component, again, using properties and a render method and so forth. And then index.html under content is, again, a functional component, an extremely basic functional component. But it just kind of shows how the directory structures can be set up and how they work. Pretty simplistic as far as that structure. I think it's pretty common to what people are used to in the React world and the Preact world. The tooling will compile all of these and build them in as you need them. Now, one of the other things that's actually delivered with Jet 11, one of the other new features, is a brand new CLI command called ojet add webpack. And that will literally add webpack into your application and replace require.js as the packager, as the bundler. So when you do an ojet build -- release, it'll use webpack instead of require.js. So that's how you actually create the application and get started using the CLI. But there may be situations, and I mentioned this at the beginning of this segment, that where VDOM may not actually be what you want to work with. So when should you actually be using Virtual DOM and the VComponent API? Well, under the new website, oracle.com/jet will get you to the website. If we click on Get Started, you're going to see a new little section right down here at the bottom. It says Explore the new Virtual DOM architecture. If we click on that, it's going to take us over to this VDOM architecture page. This gives you links to that VComponent tutorial that we just showed you. It also takes you to the API docs about the VComponent API module, and it will take you to the VDOM FAQ. Now, this offers or answers some of the questions that we've been talking about. There's 3 of them that we haven't quite gotten into yet. And this is the thing about when should I migrate? So migrate an application, migrate components, even the new VComponents if you need to migrate those. I'll explain that one in just a minute. So let's start with the application one. So should you migrate your existing MVVM application, knockout-based application? The answer to that is no. You really should not. The VDOM architecture is a completely new architecture. If you have an existing app, it would be a complete rewrite of that application to move it into this virtual DOM world. Maybe you want to do that, but it's highly unlikely. What is much, much more likely is that you would take sections of that existing application or maybe new content that you're going to put in and write that in the virtual DOM architecture, wrap it in a web component or a custom element, and then add that custom element into your existing application. Because that VDOM or the VComponent API and the web components that are generated using it interoperate between both of these architectures. They'll work in Visual Builder, they'll work within the Jet core under MVVM, and they'll work within the virtual DOM architecture. So that's your interoperability layer. And that's a good way for you to start to learn and work with virtual DOM, is by building up some of these components and maybe replacing smaller portions of your application using VDOM. But you're not going to rewrite your entire app. There is not a migration tool. It is a rewrite. So that brings us to the components. If you've got a bunch of custom components already using the composite component architecture, or CCA, you've built web components using that, should you migrate those over to the VComponent API? Really, the question or the answer here is maybe. And I know that's kind of cheating, but it depends on the complexity of that component. If it's a pretty simple component, maybe it's just doing some layouts and things of that nature, sure, go ahead and migrate it. It is a rewrite. It is not a migration. I use the word migration, but it really isn't. It is a rewrite of that component. Again, no migration tools. But if it's a simple component, it might not be that difficult to rewrite it, and you might get some benefits in performance and so forth, depending on what the component's doing. If it's a really complex component, there really isn't any need to rewrite it. But maybe when you think again about new features and functionalities, or maybe you want to get to a point where you do want to rewrite it and come up with something new, look at the virtual DOM architecture and the VComponent API as the place that you would want to write that new component. We recommend that all new web components be written using the VComponent API. CCA is still there. It will continue to be there, but we really recommend this new VComponent API as the way forward. So finally, migrating this existing VComponents. Now, the VComponent API, or the VComponent module, has actually been in existence since Jet 9. There are some folks that have found it in our API documentation. It was there. You could, if you were reading through the docs, you may have come across it. And we did have some people that actually wrote some custom elements using that VComponent API. It was in an experimental state. It was an experimental API. It was always marked as experimental. It used a different virtual DOM engine called Petit DOM. We decided just before, around the time of Jet 10, to convert over to Preact instead of using Petit DOM. So anything that you've written in the past, if you were one of those few people that decided to experiment, those components must be migrated or rewritten over to use Preact. The Petit DOM is not distributed, the Petit DOM library is not distributed with Jet V11. So anything that you've written using that old library just flat out will not run on Jet 11. You have to do a migration for that. If you happen to be one of those teams that have done that, you can contact us either through the community forum or the community Slack channel. Let us know. We'll provide you with a migration guide on how you can actually make those changes over from Petit DOM to Preact. But you must do the migration. Your component won't run in Jet 11. Now, this FAQ actually has quite a bit of other information in here. I highly recommend you take a listen to it or take a read through it. Things like, I don't see knockout. You're right, knockout is not included whatsoever in the virtual DOM environment. It is all based on Preact, TypeScript, and so forth. We talk about the difference between Preact and React. For the development environment, not the runtime, but the development environment, there are some different libraries and minimum versions that we require. You can take a look at those and see what they are. Pretty reasonable versions. It's pretty much up to date with what people would be using. This Node 12 and the 12 LTS, which is recommended, that's a minimum. You can use 14 if you want to. Please don't use the nightly builds. We do recommend using an LTS release for Node, and whatever NPM comes with those is fine. So with that information in front of you, you've got plenty to go off and take a look at and read through. Links will be at the bottom in the description if you're looking at this on YouTube. If you're on the Jet website, on the Virtual DOM page and watching this from there, just scroll down a little bit. You'll see some links down there on how to get to the Virtual DOM Developers Guide, as well as in the footer, different resources for learning about different ways to work with Jet. Thanks again for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in our next segment, where we'll actually start to get into some of the differences between moving from MVVM over to the VDOM architecture. What are the coding differences, things like that. So hope to see you in that next segment. Thanks.